So the other day, I found myself watching the documentary about Jay-Z, as you know, most preachers do. I was watching it, and there was a fun moment near the end where Jay gets on the subway to Brooklyn, and he's, of course, swarmed by people with cameras and such, and he sits down to this elderly woman, next to this elderly woman named Ellen, and she has no idea who he is. She says to him, "Are you famous?" And he's like, "I'm a little famous, not that famous." And it was kind of fun, right? And I saw this scene and I thought, oh wow, that fits so well with the Bible book of Hebrews. I mean, isn't that what you think when you would see that, right? Here's why. There are times in life when we're sitting right next to greatness and we don't even realize that it's happening. We're right there by someone incredible and we don't know it. And I think that's actually a pretty accurate picture of where a lot of us land with Jesus. Not that we've consciously rejected him or decided he's not real. It's more that we just don't know how he fits into the modern world. And if he was to walk into this room, and I'm not even sure we would recognize him. I mean, who really is Jesus in modern American life? For most people on the street, if you ask them, he's like this old dead Jewish guy who lived in Israel 2,000 years ago, and he said some nice things. And the average person's honest reaction is probably something like, Jesus, yeah, okay, whatever. Like, why does that even matter to me now? I think for most Americans, Jesus is, if he even exists, is basically like an inspirational meme. He says kind things, but he's not actually authoritative for our real lives. He's comforting, but he's not really confrontational. He's a good teacher. He's a moral example, a spiritual option maybe, one voice among many in a very noisy world. He's kind of like your grandma and Gandhi and maybe Mr. Rogers, like all rolled into one. And honestly, I think that version of Jesus is the one most of us are carrying around, and I think that version is just way too small. Because what if the one that you've been casually walking alongside without much thought is nothing like what you think? And honestly, that question bothers me a little, because I've met too many people at this church over the years. I've met too many people who have walked away from a Jesus that they never actually knew. They rejected something too small. And I don't want that to be you. So that's kind of the question this series is going to keep asking. And it starts right here in what we're going to look at in the first 4 verses of Hebrews. So here's what we're doing. We're spending 14 weeks in a letter in the New Testament, and the letter's called Hebrews. And I want to acknowledge something right up front, because I just told a room full of people that we're going to spend 14 weeks in a book of the Bible, and I watched about a third of you in your head start to do the math on how many Sundays that is, and then you're like kind of calculating like, could I be out of town for some of that? And I understand. I think that's fair. I respect the honesty. But stay with me, because I think this is going to be worth it. Here's what this series is not. This is not a Hebrews lecture series. I'm not trying to make you an expert in first century Jewish Christian literature. There will be no quiz. Nobody's going to ask you to name the 5 warning passages that appear in the book, or explain the Levitical priesthood at a dinner party. And if someone does ask you that, those are not the people you need to be having dinner with, so don't worry about it. What I care about is what happens in you over these next 14 weeks, not like what information ends up in your head. Because honestly, if you've been around me, you've heard me say this. Information has never been your problem, and it's not my problem either. Most of us know enough. The question is whether what we know is actually doing anything to us. So the series is called Greater, and the entire argument of the book of Hebrews comes down to one idea, and it's basically this: whatever you're living for, whatever you're trusting, whatever you're giving your best energy and attention and devotion to, Jesus is greater than that. Not like slightly better, not like one solid option in a crowded field. He's greater. And the letter's going to make the case week after week with a persistence that's going to either feel very freeing to you or maybe a little challenging, depending on where you are when you walk in the door. Now, let me give you a little context on the letter. The people who first received this letters were not outsiders or pagans who had never heard of Jesus. They were already in. These were the people who were in Jesus. They were people that had signed up. They were all in on this. But life for them had gotten quite hard. and there's persecution. And so following Jesus was costing people in the first century. It was costing them socially and economically and relationally. And the temptation for them and is when things get hard and starts costing something, and it's the temptation for us too. We drift back into old beliefs and habits. Now, the pressure looks different in Richmond in 2026 than it did for them, right? Nobody is threatening your livelihood for showing up here on a Sunday. But the competition for your attention and your trust and your allegiance has honestly never been more intense. There's success and comfort and status and distraction and 1,000 good things that quietly become ultimate things. And there's 1,000 voices that slowly crowd out the one voice that matters most. So the author of Hebrews wrote to people who needed to be reminded of who Jesus actually is. So, and I think so do we. So before we go any further into the arguments of this letter, we need to establish some things about Jesus right up front. So let's dive in. I want to just focus on the first 4 verses of the letter here because it makes some pretty strong claims about Jesus right up front. And this is one of these things that if we don't get this right, and we won't understand anything else that comes after this. So let me read to you Hebrews 1. This is the way the letter starts. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. All right, so let's pull this apart a little bit and look at what the letter says right out of the gate. Verse 1 through 4, what I just read to you, in Greek, that this is written, are actually one long sentence, okay? So one big kind of run-on sentence, which is crazy, right? The author just unloads everything he wants you to know about Jesus before he makes a single argument. It's like he's saying, look, before we go any further, before I make any comparisons or make the case for anything, you need to understand who we're actually talking about here. Let me just say this also about this book. We don't know who wrote this letter. There's a lot of speculation out there. I'm just going to say the author. I'm going to say, when I talk about it, I'm going to say the author, and I'm probably going to say he. Maybe it was a lady. We don't know. But saying he or she for 14 weeks is going to get really old for me and probably for you too. Okay, so we don't know exactly who the author is. We good? All right, let's go. All right, so he starts the letter like this. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, and at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. Now, that's not a throwaway opening line. For a Jewish audience, this sentence is a big deal. The prophets weren't just like regular religious figures. They were the primary way that God had communicated with his people for centuries. There was dreams and visions, a burning bush, still small voices. God was always speaking to his people in various ways, and the Jewish people loved that. They loved it. They built their whole understanding of God around it. They were the people, the Jews thought of themselves, the Israelites thought of themselves as, we are the people who heard from God. He speaks to us. But then the author kind of makes this turn. He says, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. The word but right there is doing a lot of work. He's not saying God stopped speaking through the prophets because they weren't good enough. He's saying something has changed. The mode of communication has shifted. And all of that, all of these centuries of prophets and dreams and visions was God speaking in pieces and little parts, right? Now God has spoken fully and finally and completely. Like he's not spoken to us through a message, but he's spoken to us through a person, and not just any person. Now listen, this is big, don't miss this. Do you want to know what God is like? I think a lot of us would. We'd say like, man, if there's a creator of the universe, I want to know what he's like. And if you want to know what he's like, you don't have to go sit under a tree for like 50 years and think about it and try to figure out. If you want to know what God is like, Hebrews author would tell us, then look at Jesus. That's basically it. Jesus is God in the flesh. There's no guesswork, no deep contemplation in a monastery. Just God walked on the earth in the form of Jesus. Now, the author, I read them to, he stacks like 6 claims about Jesus in the space of these 3 verses. And honestly, if you're not careful, you're gonna read right past them because they come so fast. Let me just slow it down because each one of these is massive on its own. We're not gonna have time to unpack all 6 of them. But he says, these are the things he says. He says, Jesus is the heir of all things. He says, Jesus is the one through whom God created the world. He says, Jesus is the radiance of the glory of God. He says, Jesus is the exact imprint of God's nature. He says, Jesus upholds the word by his power. And then he says, Jesus made purification for sins and sat down at the right hand of God. So there's 6 claims right there, 3 verses, calling Jesus the prophet, creator, the radiance, the exact image, the sustainer, the priest, and the king, basically. Our Hebrews is just throwing like all his Jesus cards on the table right up front. And I want to camp out on 2 of those because I think they're the ones that most of us just read past them without actually understanding what's being said. The first is that phrase, he's the exact imprint of his nature. In Greek, the word is character, which is where we get, guess what English word? Yes, you got it. You guys, see, you're great at this. Character, that's right, okay? It's fun when that happens. But in the ancient world, it had a very specific meaning. It referred to the impression that you left behind when you pressed a signet ring into wax. So when a king or nobleman sealed a document, he pressed his ring into soft wax and it left behind a precise, exact image of that ring. Not a similar image, not like a rough approximation, the exact image, and with every detail. And the author is saying that's what Jesus is in relation to God. He's not similar to God. He's not like a good representation of God. He's the exact imprint of God, which means if you want to know what God is actually like, you don't speculate, you don't project your own stuff, you don't construct some new thing, you just look at Jesus. Your picture of God is only ever going to be as accurate as your picture of Jesus. Hold that thought because we're going to come back to it. The second thing I want to sort of flag here and get us to notice is the last phrase. It says, after making purification for sins, it says that Jesus sat down at the right hand of God. That might sound like a small detail for us, but for a Jewish reader, it was like anything but small, and here's why. In the entire design of the Jewish sacrificial system of the tabernacle and then what Moses laid out later, and then later the temple, there was no furniture for the priest to sit on, things we would call like chairs, right? They didn't have this in the tabernacle. The priests that were working there, doing the work of the people before God, they stood always because the work was never finished. Every single day, they make sacrifice after sacrifice, offering after offering, and none of it was ever fully good enough to deal with sin. The work was always ongoing. There's always more to do. It was basically like laundry at your house. And then Jesus makes one sacrifice for sins once, and then he sits down because the work is finished. There's nothing left to add to it. He's not standing because he's done, and that's not just a theological idea. That's actually really good news for people who are exhausted from trying to be enough. I don't know what you carried in here today, but I know some of you are tired in a way that a good night's sleep is not going to fix. And this might be the most important thing I say to you all morning. You don't have to earn your way to a God who has already moved towards you. Jesus has already made a way for us. We meet him. We trust him. We get baptized into him that we saw on video of Harrison doing. We get baptized into him and we follow him. What he has done for us is enough to make us right before our Creator. Now I want to walk you through a couple applications of this because I don't want our time in Hebrews to be kind of like where we're like, oh, that was kind of interesting and not practical. When we read through the Bible, we want to ask, what does this mean? But also, we really want to ask, what am I going to do with that? If you know what it means and you do nothing with it, you can slowly become an arrogant hypocrite. And I don't think the world needs more of those. So if you're constantly trying to do something with it without taking the time to understand what it means, you're going to possibly make a lot of mistakes and hurt people along the way. So we really need both. We need to understand what it means, and then we need to know something to do with it, okay? We want to know Hebrews this summer, but we want to make sure we do something with it. Remember, information is not the problem for transformation. Our head knowledge needs to sink into our hearts and ultimately get worked out in our hands and feet with what we're doing. So let me give you a couple applications of these verses. Number one is this: Jesus is God's final and clearest word. So here's the thing I want you to take from those first 4 verses. The author opens by saying God spoke through the prophets at many times, many ways, and now he's spoken through his son, which means Jesus isn't just one voice in a long lineup of voices that God has sent into the world. He's the final word. He's the clearest thing God has ever said, the fullest revelation of who God is, and what he says is what God actually wants. That's a massive claim, and it has, I think, a pretty strong implication for how we live. Here's what's true about you and me in 2026. We are the most informed, most stimulated, most voice noise saturated people who have ever lived on the planet. The average American adult now is spending over 7 hours a day looking at a screen. 7 hours. That's not including work for most people. That's just chill time and consumption. We check our phones, I looked this up, 186 times a day, which works out to about once every 5 to 10 minutes during waking hours. I had to check my phone like 3 times just to make sure that stat was correct. But think about that. Once every few minutes, something or someone is getting our attention and saying something to us 186 times a day, which means statistically speaking, several of you have already checked your phone since I started this sermon. And honestly, I respect your commitment there. You're really going with the bit, and I appreciate that. We're not even counting things like podcasts or play in the car, or like the music playing while we cook dinner, or the conversation at the office, or the news crawl on the TVs at the gym. We are just swimming in voices. We are absolutely drowning in input. And here's the thing that maybe nobody really wants to say out loud, but I'll probably just say it anyway because I'm weird like that. Those voices aren't neutral. Every single thing you consume is forming you in some direction. The podcasts you listen to are shaping how you think about money and politics and relationships and what a good life looks like. The social media accounts you follow are quietly constructing your picture of what you should want, what you should look like, what you should be afraid of, and what success actually means. The shows you binge on are giving you a vision of the world and your place in it. None of that is neutral. All of it is discipling you. The only question is whether you're paying attention to what it's actually teaching you. Discipling, that's the word we use in church for the process of being formed and shaped by something over time. We call it discipleship. And most of us think discipleship is something that happens on purpose in a church with a Bible open. And at A10, we definitely do that. There are many people in this church who sit with an open Bible and a highlighter and read a few chapters of it every day in order to become more like Jesus. There's over 100 people that have done that at this church and continue to do that. But discipleship is actually just the unavoidable result of like sustained attention. Whatever you give your sustained attention to over time is going to shape what you believe. It's going to shape what you value and how you see the world. Which means you are being discipled right now, today, whether you've chosen a discipler or not. The algorithm has chosen one for you if you haven't. So the question the author of Hebrews is pressing right on us from verse 1 is not, do you believe in Jesus? The question is whether Jesus is actually the voice you're orienting your life around, or whether he's just one more thing competing for your attention in an already overcrowded news feed. Because if God has spoken his clearest, fullest, most complete word through Jesus, then treating him like one inspirational voice among many is a big mistake. We have to lock in on what he tells us to do. So here's a useful thing to try this week, and I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. I'm just asking an honest question. Don't do this right now, you can do this later, but pull up your screen time report on your phone. It's in your settings, it'll take you about 15 seconds. If you don't know how to find that in your phone, ask a teenager. And it will tell you exactly how many hours you spent last week on what. Now, rather than beat yourself up about that number that you see there, instead just ask yourself, based on what I actually give my attention to this past week, what am I being formed to believe? Based on what I actually gave my attention to this past week, what am I being formed to believe? What vision of the good life is being built in me right now? Not what do I say I believe, what does my actual attention tell the truth about what I believe? Because Jesus being the final word of God is only life-changing information if he's actually the word you're listening to. So that's number one. Let me give you a second application of this. Number two, your picture of God is only as accurate as your picture of Jesus. Let me take you back to that Greek word, that word character, the exact imprint. The author is saying Jesus is not a representative of God or a messenger from God, not even like a pretty good reflection of God. He's the exact imprint of God's nature, which means if you want to know what God's like, you look at Jesus. You don't look at your circumstances. You don't look at your childhood. You don't look at your worst moments when you were convinced God had forgotten you or what you thought God was actively annoyed with you. You look at Jesus. And I want to push on this a bit because I think this is where people are carrying something they don't even realize they're carrying. Most of us have a picture of God that was built long before we ever seriously engaged with Jesus. It got built over the years from like 100 different sources. Church, parents, bad experiences, a few scenes from the movie Bruce Almighty. All of this together, it's a collage is how we understand who God is. And it's usually not very accurate. Maybe you grew up in a religious environment where God was mostly a rule enforcer or a cosmic scorekeeper who was like mostly disappointed in you and occasionally willing to cut you some slack if you behaved. Maybe you grew up with no religious background at all, and your picture of God was just kind of like this vague, distant, probably not real presence that didn't have much to do with your actual life. Maybe, like me, you have some dad hangover when you think of God. Maybe you had a dad who was absent or harsh or impossible to please. And without even realizing it, that experience shaped pretty much every thought you've ever had about God. Maybe you prayed hard for something once and it didn't happen. And somewhere in the back of your mind, God became the guy who doesn't show up when things get hard and when it mattered. The point is this, none of us come to this with a blank slate. We all have a picture. And the question the author of Hebrews is pressing us is whether your picture is accurate. A.W. Tozer once wrote, "What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us." What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. And right now, you're sitting there going, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. I got 10 things I could think of that are more important than that. But look, I've been sitting with that quote for years, and I think he's right. Because everything flows from that picture. If your picture of God is wrong, everything downstream of that's going to be way off. How you pray or whether you pray at all, whether you trust God when things get hard, or whether you just quietly assume he doesn't care about your situation, whether you come to God when you've messed up or whether you do what most people do, which is clean yourself up first and then try to and then show up like when you feel a little more presentable. All of that flows from your picture of God. And the Hebrew authors is making a big claim. I know this is maybe a little controversial in a like, can't we all get along kind of America that we live in, but he's saying the most accurate picture of God that exists is Jesus. Not a theological concept of Jesus, not a church's version of Jesus, the actual Jesus, the one who touched lepers when no one else would, the one who sat down with people that everyone else had written off, the one who got genuinely angry about injustice and genuinely moved by grief, the one who looked at a room full of people who were about to abandon him and wash their feet anyway. That is what God is like. That's the character, the imprint, the exact imprint. So what I want you to do is think about the gap, if there is one, between your gut level picture of God and the Jesus that you actually see in the Gospels. I'm talking about your emotional gut reaction when life gets hard and then you think about God, when you've failed and you imagine how God sees you right now in failure, when you're afraid and you wonder whether God actually cares and about the specific thing that's keeping you up at night. Where does your gut go to in those moments? Because that's your actual picture of God. And if it doesn't look like Jesus, it's worth asking where it came from and whether it's actually true. Now, some of you are probably pretty skeptical of all of this. I'm up here making a lot of claims about someone who lived a long time ago and seems irrelevant to modern contemporary life. But can I just challenge you here in this series this summer to really examine this Jesus guy as he's presented here in Hebrews? I'm not asking you to feel something, but really just look at something and see if it's real. See if Jesus is real and see if Jesus really matters to the people that are in this room. And honestly, that's the invitation the author of Hebrews is making too. But before he gets into angels, which we'll talk about next week, and he's going to talk about priests and covenants and sacrifices and all the rest, he starts with this question, who exactly is Jesus? Because if we get that wrong, everything else gets distorted after it. If Jesus is just a comforting spiritual idea, then he's useful when life falls apart, but mostly irrelevant the rest of the time. But Hebrews will not let us shrink him down into something that small. So the letter says Jesus is the exact imprint of God, the creator and sustainer of all things, the one holding the universe together right now by the power of his word, which means the center of Christianity, of our faith, is not ultimately a philosophy or some sort of moral code or even like a religion. It's a person. And the invitation of Christianity is not try harder or clean yourself up or be more religious. The invitation is to draw near to that person. And here's what's really cool about this. The same Jesus that Hebrews describes as sustaining galaxies is also the Jesus who, it says, made purification for our sins and sat down. He didn't stay distant from us. He moved towards us. He took on flesh. He stepped into suffering. He carried sin and shame and death. He carried all that onto a cross and then walked out of a grave 3 days later, which means the God who is, we think of as distant, but who is holy, is also near. And there's something powerful about that. I think that's why when we take communion together, that's why communion matters. Because communion's not just a ritual we tack on to the end of the service. It's a reminder of who Jesus actually is. The bread that we take reminds us of the idea that God took on flesh, and the cup reminds us that his blood was poured out for us. And the table reminds us, with no chairs around it, it reminds us that the work is finished. He sat down. There's nothing left for you to prove, nothing left for you to earn. There's no sacrifice left for you to make so God will finally love you. Jesus already made a way. So I want to challenge you today as we stand and you go out the left of your aisle and down the front, you tear off the bread and dip it into the juice as you come forward. I just want you to sit with one question. What version of Jesus have you been carrying around in your head? Is it a small Jesus, a safe Jesus, convenient Jesus, inspirational Jesus, distant Jesus, or the Jesus that Hebrews introduces us to here, which is the one who is greater than all of that? We're going to take this time of communion. We're going to sing a worship song as we do this. If you want to leave an offering or put your connection card, there are boxes at each table. You can do that there as well. Let's stand together and sing and celebrate this Jesus.